Welcome to Conversations with Dr. Steve. In today's podcast, we are going to be looking at two different ways that the Bible can be interpreted. I think it is very important for the Christian to understand these two perspectives and these two ways of interpreting Scripture, because depending on which method you use, your interpretation could be very dramatically different. Before we get started, I want to read from the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 1, 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. Then I want to look at Psalm 44, verse 1. We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us the deeds you did in those days, in days of old. What we see in these two passages of Scripture is what is called the historical narrative method of Scripture interpretation and of Scripture communication. The historical narrative, that is the way that the ancient societies would hand down the stories that we read in the Bible, was simply through storytelling. That's called narrative, telling the narrative of God's provision for the nation of Israel, telling the narrative of God delivering the nation of Israel. And those narratives, those stories, were handed down through the generations. You have to think context at this point. If you don't, you're going to run aground in your interpretation of biblical history. The problem we have is, in our modern society, we find it difficult to re-gear our thinking and imagine a time when there were no cell phones, no flat screen TVs, no satellites, no computers, no laptops, no iPads, no types of electronic communication. And I might add, no method of electronic history storage. To be more specific, I have a list here. The first electrical recording was 1925. The first photographs were 1822. The first video was in 1888. The first phone call, the first cell phone call. The first cell phone call was in 1973, as was the first construction of a personal computer, in other words, one that you could have in your home, 1973, same year. That computer, by the way, was called Micro-N. So, let's go back to the first photograph, 1822, and then the first video, 1888. And the first electrical recording, 1925. So we could say, in a general way, that the ability to electronically record history to electronically record events in a person's life or in a community's life, in a nation's life, events of the world, have only existed for 100 years. But yet we have all the history prior to 1925. World War I was prior to 1925. So it's very intellectually dishonest to somehow diminish the authority of Scripture, diminish the authority of the Bible because of the way that the Bible message was handed down throughout the ages. To put it in street vernacular, look, just because Moses didn't have a cell phone, that doesn't mean that the things that Moses had to say weren't true, and that doesn't mean that Moses didn't exist. Unfortunately, in today's society, that's how some people approach the Bible. They say, well, those guys didn't have cell phones, they didn't have computers, they didn't have internet, so why should we believe anything that has been written in the Bible? We have got to escape this modern way of putting down something simply because it was not done through modern methods of information storage and retrieval. So, getting back to the historical narrative method of interpreting Scripture, we see clearly Luke writing to his friend Theophilus, saying the narrative, in other words, the story that has been told about Jesus, I want to present to you a more excellent explanation of the things I've witnessed, of the things that have happened, and to depict, describe, and to give you an understanding of who Jesus really is. This was done by Luke writing a letter to Theophilus. The other way of Bible interpretation is referred to as historical critical. And this is a very uneducational, it's dishonest actually. Historical critical goes like this. If there is an event in history that has two different descriptions of how it happened and the way it happened, and perhaps even when it happened, then that event or that person is suspect of actually having existed, or that event is suspect of actually having happened. Historical critical. And the reason this is problematic when it comes to Scripture interpretation is, especially with the four Gospels, and this is usually what those who adopt this line of thinking target, is the four Gospels. They say, well, because there is a variation in what one gospel writer says about this event compared to what the other gospel writer says about this event, then the event itself is suspect. Historical critical method. Two particular events that are described in the four Gospels that come to mind are when the woman breaks open the bottle of spikenard and pours it on Jesus's feet and then washes his feet with her hair. In different Gospels, this story is reported a little differently. So because of that, someone might say, well, because the Gospels report this story a little differently, perhaps it didn't happen, and the Gospels should just be disregarded as false history. Then another example would be the Gadarene demoniac. One Gospel reports that there were 2 demoniacs, and another Gospel reports that there was 1 demoniac. So therefore, because of this variation, the historical critical camp says, aha, because one Gospel says it this way and another Gospel says it this way, therefore we have to throw it out altogether. That's very problematic, and it's very dishonest. It's dishonest analysis. Look at it this way. Let's say, another thing before I forget it, is because the earliest they can pinpoint the Gospels having been written was around 30 to 40 years after Jesus ascended into heaven. So they say, well, the Gospels were written when Jesus was already gone, so how can we trust that they're true and accurate? After all, Jesus wasn't even around when they were written. So the historical critical camp says it's a made-up story. Jesus isn't real, they say. So now let's get back to my way of looking at this. Let's say there are 4 grandchildren, and they have a grandfather that they truly liked being around. They enjoyed visiting. They enjoyed his company. He enjoyed their company. So let's say that during the childhood of these grandchildren, the grandfather takes them all on a fishing trip. And let's say that the children are ages 14, 12, 10, and 8 years old. So they all go on a fishing trip with their grandfather. And they go out, 2 of them go out into a boat and with the grandfather, and 2 of them stay ashore and they're fishing. Let's say during the course of the day, let's say they stayed out that morning for 3 hours fishing. And let's throw in that perhaps one of the grandchildren on the boat lost his balance and fell into the water. Then the grandfather pulls him back into the boat. Let's say that one grandchild on the bank hooked a really big fish, but it got away. Let's say that different things happened, building the campfire. Maybe there was a gust of wind that blew the fire out. Different things. So with these 4 grandchildren, let's say they grow up. Let's say it's 40 years past the date of that fishing trip. The grandfather has passed away and he hasn't been in their lives for 30 years. Then one day, those 4 grandchildren, now adults, get together and start describing the fishing trip that Grandpa took us on. You're going to have 4 different interpretations of that fishing trip. And you're going to have 4 different interpretations of each moment of that fishing trip. When the one grandchild falls into the water, you'll certainly have 4 different interpretations of that dramatic event. When the one grandchild hooked the big fish that got away, you're going to have 4 different stylistic interpretations of that event on that fishing trip. It's the same way with the 4 Gospels. You have 4 different people, 4 different men with 4 different personalities, 4 different perspectives of what was important to them concerning Jesus, and they will focus on different characteristics, different aspects of their experience with Jesus, and report them in different ways and different styles. That is absolutely no reason to disregard and disqualify the 4 Gospels. A very well-written book on this subject is this book. It's titled 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus ? Now, this author does not question whether or not Jesus existed or exists. He's simply putting that question mark to counter the thesis that because the 4 Gospels may have variations, that somehow Jesus didn't exist. In his book, Burridge uses the example of 4 paintings that were painted of Winston Churchill. So the 4 painters painted paintings of Winston Churchill over a period of time, and to look at the 4 paintings, they are all very different in style, different in painting technique, but yet they are of the same man. So, according to the historical critical method of interpretation, a person using that method of interpretation would look at these 4 paintings and say, aha, this painting is different than that one is different than these 3, the 4th one doesn't look like it was painted in the same style, therefore Winston Churchill must not have existed. You say, that's ridiculous. That is exactly how the historical critical camp looks at the 4 Gospels. This book, I'll read a couple of paragraphs out of it. Page 2, 4 pictures all different, each with its own story, evoking its own atmosphere and provoking its own response in the viewer. Yet all are of one and the same man. This is the skill of the portrait painter or the clever photographer. Each intends to communicate an image to us and to make us respond. It varies according to the setting, people or objects which are included or excluded. And there is scope for the creativity and inspiration of the artist. And then on page 3, Burridge writes, yet here too, there are limits to the publicist's creativity. There must be some continuity between reality and image, between the advert and the product, between the person being depicted and the picture being painted. When we put several different portraits of the same person together, we can see immediately both the diversity and the continuity. Through comparison, we appreciate the skill of the different artists and consider carefully their varying interpretations of the subject. Same way, we look at the skill of the 4 Gospel writers and how they interpreted Jesus, how they interpreted the history of Jesus and how they interpreted the impact Jesus had on society, and how they interpreted the stories that were told about Jesus, and how they interpreted their eyewitnessing of the miracles Jesus performed. Again, it is simply intellectually dishonest to say that just because 4 different people knowing the same man would have slight variations of the interpretation of that man. So we see clearly that the Bible, as handed down through the generations, down through the ages, has been done so by the historical narrative method of storytelling and communicating the life of Jesus. We need to interpret the scripture in this context.